It was a warm summer evening when Dory gave birth to a boy. She would name him Ed. He was a beautiful Palomino horse with a good structure. She was very proud of him. However, even as a young boy, Ed found that he was different from all of the other horses. He would listen to Tim, the young kid that lived on the farm, and mimic what he was saying in his mind. By the age of just 1, he realized that he too could speak to people while using their own language. Each and every day Tim and Ed went out together. They played, they walked at first, and by the age of 2 Timmy and Ed went everywhere together. Ed would allow only Tim to ride him. If anyone else tried to ride him, Ed would just sit down and the person would end up listening to others laugh at the predicament they had found themselves in. One day while Tim was sitting by the creek, he was playing with a stick in the rocks when he turned to Ed and said, "I wish you could talk, Ed, you were my best friend." It was with that Ed gave him an answer. "Tim, I can talk. You are my best friend also." From then on, Ed and Tim would have long discussions about everything: school, friends, family, you name it. Tim taught Ed how to read and socialize among people. Unfortunately, Ed was a horse and property of Tim's parents. He was a good sturdy horse and had to be exposed to reproduction. He would father many and would not even know who they were. It was hard on Ed as he wanted to know his children and family. He loved his mother very much. He did know that one of the horse's mother's name was Myra. People talked freely around Ed because they had no idea that he could talk. This caused some pretty embarrassing moments for the men, and Tim and Ed were always laughing and playing. One day Ed once found one of the farm hands was eating donut. He had heard that he was a diabetic and shouldn't be eating things with a lot of sugar. Mr. Ed had spoken up in his deep voice and said, "You know you are not supposed to eat that." The guy had dropped the donut and then looked around wondering who had said that. That got a chuckle out of Mr. Ed. With Tim, Ed became a great jumper and always looked forward to going to the school with Tim and meeting his friends. Mr. Ed loved to give them rides. Most of the kids were fun. But, at a school there were teachers, and some of them were not of the friendly sort. One day a teacher who Mr. Ed had never been fond of was picking on one of the younger kids. She was laughing that he couldn't button his own jacket. After a few minutes Mr. Ed lost his temper and with a quick movement he grabbed her jacket and ripped it off of her. While she was standing there in shock, he threw her jacket over into a snowbank. All of the children laughed as she ran to get her jacket. It was quite funny. Mr. Ed never spoke to anyone but Tim. He was now happy and living free on the farm. It was the day that Tim didn't come to see him that he would never forget. It was a Thursday morning and Ed had been busy enjoying some fresh hay when he had heard the news. 2 of the farm hands were talking and said that Tim had been hit by a car just the night before. He had died and Ed's life turned upside down. Soon after this Mr. Ed found himself living on another farm. He heard the farm hands talking. Tim's mom had not been able to keep Mr. Ed, as every time that she saw him she would break down and cry. Mr. Ed was well cared for but moved around a lot during the next few years. He made himself happy as just a normal horse, but found himself lonely. Gone were the fun days and he didn't think that they would ever come back. Finally, Ed was living in a small barn by himself where he could enjoy his time. The home was lovely and it was very peaceful. But, once more to his sadness, the people had moved out. He now had to wonder what would happen to him. Ed watched as a moving van pulled into the driveway and he saw a young couple arriving in a car. There was something about this new man. He seemed very friendly and reminded him of his friend Tim. His name was Wilbur and he and Wilbur were going to become the best of friends. One thing that Wilbur did was to set up his office in the barn. There the two would have long conversations and Mr. Ed would always find a way to make life challenging. But, they were the best of friends and many a day were spent on horseback with Wilbur at the park. It had not been more than a year, when one day Wilbur and Mr. Ed had gone to the park as they always had, but, there standing next to some kids was a man that they had never seen. He was with a mule named Francis. Mr. Ed liked the man right away. He was funny and witty and obviously cared very much for the mule. But, as he played with the children as he always had, Ed noticed something different about this mule. Yes, he was sure of it, the mule was speaking to the man. Mr. Ed needed to get to know the man. Wilbur had been busy with the children when Ed had decided to just walk over to the mule. Wilbur introduced himself and found out that his name was Peter Sterling and the mule's name was Francis. As the two of them spoke, Mr. Ed went over to Francis and talked. "I know that you can talk," Mr. Ed said. "I heard you speaking to Peter." Francie was a mule and one thing about mules is that they can be stubborn. But, Francis found this horse interesting. How did he know that he was talking to Peter unless he too spoke? And so the two began to talk. They soon discovered that Myrna was Francis's mother, and that meant that Mr. Ed was Francis's father. The two put their bodies next to each other and did a horse hug. That night the four new friends sat around a campfire and had a great old time. Peter and Francis had just moved into a farm not far from the post home, and they would be seeing a lot of each other. And so the story continues.